And welcome back. Now, Africa and Latin America have the greatest wealth inequality in the world. And this is according to Oxfam Africa, which further says that the prospects of achieving a Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 2063 are severely diminished. But how does South Africa fare in all of this? Well, let's find out from the Executive Director of Oxfam Africa, Winnie Byanyima. And she joins me now from our Sea Point studios in Cape Town. Winnie, thanks for speaking to us this morning and welcome to Morning Live.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You must know that South Africa, of course, Winnie, is often described as the most unequal country in the world. But it's not peculiar just to South Africa, because Africa as a whole also shares in this burden. Please tell us more about Oxfam's research into inequality on the continent.
Yes, Oxfam has released a report yesterday on inequality in Africa. And we're saying that extreme inequality is on the rise and is actually out of control. We have a continent where everywhere else in the world, poverty is reducing, but poverty here is increasing. And it's estimated that by 2030, 87% of the most poor people in the world will be living here in Africa. So it's a call to action to leaders to run their economies differently, because extreme inequality is a result of choices, policy choices that governments have made. On this continent are four most unequal countries in the world: Swaziland, South Africa, Nigeria, or did I say Nigeria? Swaziland, South Africa, Nigeria, and sorry, I've forgotten the fourth one. So these countries are the most unequal in the world. But the good news is that some African countries are taking action against inequality. And these we show in our report are countries that are taking action on social spending, maintaining spending on health, education, social protection, that are progressive in their taxation, putting the burden of taxation on the richest people and big companies and relieving poor people from the high burden of taxation. And there are those countries where workers' rights are guaranteed, a minimum wage is guaranteed. Those three areas are inequality busting areas, and we are asking governments to move in that direction. We also point to the high level of debt in the continent that is actually moving Africa into a very difficult area where debt, the risk of being at the highest levels of debt and sustainability is increasing for each country. We are seeing countries like Kenya, for example, moving to a point where its debt repayments have trebled in the last 3 years. And we are seeing them moving towards reducing their social spending. Angola's debt repayments have now gotten up to 57% of their GDP. And that also means that they have cut their social spending by 19% in the last 2 years. So we're saying to governments, don't move in that direction. We did that in the 80s and 90s with structured adjustment. The results were disastrous for African people. So we're calling on governments to look at earlier negotiation of debt reduction, debt rescheduling. Some countries are doing that and doing it carefully, protecting the social spending. We're saying don't cut your social spending, maintain it, increase it in fact. South Africa is a top performer in this regard. We have ranked our African countries, and we see South Africa coming out at the top. It's coming from a legacy of apartheid and colonialism and extreme inequality, but moving fast in terms of its social spending on health and education, in terms of progressive taxation. It's the country that is taxing most progressively on the continent. We're seeing South Africa giving a pension to every South African except the richest. This is money in the pockets of ordinary people. And we are seeing South Africa negotiating towards a minimum wage for workers. These are the right things. But South Africa is coming from difficult past, a very terrible legacy of apartheid and colonialism, and will take longer to reduce inequality to where it will ensure that people are not trapped in poverty, but it's taking the right actions. But we also see countries that are not, like Nigeria. It's at the bottom of our index. And look, this is the biggest economy in Africa, but with 10 million children out of school, with a high level of infant mortality. Nigeria is a country with the same level of per capita income as Vietnam. Vietnam's children are all in school. Not one is out of school. Vietnam has a very low, 5 times lower rate of infant mortality. Policy choices is the choices our countries make.
How much of a choice is it really when it comes to policies? Because when countries, for example, get these loans from the Bretton Woods institutions, how much of a choice do they really have in terms of the policy formulation around that?
Actually, when it comes to the debt situation, we see that Africa's debt now is very different from the debt that Africa had 20, 30 years ago. It's not owed mainly to the international financial institutions. Only 15% of the total debt is now owed to the IMF and the World Bank. Actually, there's now a range of creditors. There are private creditors. Africa has been borrowing on the market, commercial loans, and yet investing in long-term projects like infrastructure. That itself is a problem because there's a mismatch between the maturity of the projects and the terms for the paying back. Then we also have creditors like China, a new creditor. 1/3 of the debt is owed to China, and a little bit now to the European and the Western donors. So because of that, Africa needs to move quickly to find a coordinated mechanism for renegotiating this debt, because it's now peaking to a point where Africa isn't able to get credit for investing in the lives of people and in infrastructure. And let me say this, some of this debt we are seeing is actually odious debt. It is debt that should never have been contracted. In one country, Mozambique, civil society organizations, including Oxfam, are supporting a case in the British courts, 2 cases, where we see that loans were contracted without due regard to the laws of Mozambique of lending and without even the due diligence that companies should have taken before they. So we're seeing a case of reckless lenders, reckless borrowing. And we are saying citizens, poor people, should not have to pay back these debts. So we are asking the courts in the UK to declare these companies and these debts illegitimate so that ordinary people are not trapped in debt that was incurred illegally and that whose benefit the people do not see. So there's a lot to do here for African governments to sort out the debt, create the space again, the fiscal space for investing in people and in infrastructure. But there's also a lot to do on the legal front, guaranteeing a minimum wage, guaranteeing workers' rights, guaranteeing and then spending on not only social services like education and health, but on social infrastructure that supports the burden of care that women face. Because women face a tougher situation in the economy than men because of the higher burden of care that they have to do that's not paid and that takes them out of paid work. So child care, elderly care. These investments equalize for women.
And this is a very interesting report and highlights some very interesting things. Africa's 3 richest billionaire men, for example, having more wealth than the bottom 50%. You heard that right. 3 men, 3 billionaires having
Absolutely.
More wealth than the bottom 50% of the population of Africa, which equates to approximately 650 million people. So unfortunately, we can't get into this, but maybe, Winnie, we're out of time. But who are those 3 billionaires?
No. It is not important to name them. What is important is to mention that there is a structural problem here. where the economies of Africa are maximizing for a few people at the top and where the majority are trapped in poverty. That's what we have to address.
This is true.
We have to get rich companies and rich people like that to pay their fair share of taxes, because they're not. Most of their wealth is stashed away offshore.
But you see, we wanted to know who they were.
Untaxed here.
But we're out of time. Well, I think we need to spend more time on this report. But thank you all the same for your time this morning. Executive Director of Oxfam Africa, Winnie Byanyima, on that new report from Oxfam, saying that Africa and Latin America have the greatest wealth inequality in the world. And it is the detail, the finer details, that are so interesting in this report. But let's leave it there. We're going to go to a break, and then we'll go back to Cape Town for more on the WEF Africa edition.